In Canada's 2025 federal election, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of Canada's Conservative Party, lost his seat. And not just any seat, but his home riding, which he held for over 20 years. And people were absolutely stunned. Major public opinion polls, they had predicted that he would win by a long shot. But after this loss, people started searching for answers. And there are two main explanations that emerged. One was that his riding had been redrawn to include people who are likely to vote for his political opponents, and this is actually fully legitimate. But it was the second explanation that outraged people, because his ballot was stuffed with so many candidates that it listed 91 names. And people rightfully felt that there was some sort of scam, but they couldn't quite explain how the fake candidates might have tipped the results. As a behavioral scientist, I instantly recognized the problem. You see, years ago, I had the honor to train Elections Canada on how to use psychology and behavioral science to defend our democracy. And what happened in Pierre Poilievre's writing of Carleton was far from a fair fight. It perfectly matches over a century of research on how ballot design can bias election outcomes. In this video, I'm going to break down the psychology behind why long ballots reliably distort electoral outcomes, and I'll show you how publicly available data from Elections Canada that anyone can go out, download, does reveal the same pattern of bias in Poilievre's writing that's been documented in thousands of elections where candidates' position changed who won and who lost. So if you'd like to understand the psychology behind long ballot bias, stay tuned. In Canada, we live in a democracy, but democracy is just an abstract idea, and there's no universal playbook for how to elect officials. That's why every democracy develops its own patchwork of different rules, and they're constantly tweaking them to fix up problems and to keep the show on the road. Now, the recent Canadian federal election has sparked widespread suspicion that when activists stuff massive numbers of fake candidates into a ballot, that somehow this undermines our democracy. This sense of injustice is motivated because many people feel that candidate stuffing is not a legitimate part of our electoral process, and instead it's something that looks more subversive. For a behavioral scientist like myself, I can instantly see why this is a problem, and I've actually gone out, downloaded a huge amount of data and analyze the Election Canada result, and I can confirm that all the major long ballots do contain statistical proof that these elections are not fair and that they all follow such a well-established pattern of statistical bias that we can even predict how each politician will be disadvantaged. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the following subjects. We'll look at the practice of candidate stuffing in Canadian elections. I'll take you through very basic concepts in ballot psychology. We'll go into a deeper video later. We'll look at swing voter psychology. We'll go through the data with the Elections Canada results showing bias in multiple elections. And I'll show you how we could even make predictions about the disadvantage that hits candidates. And we'll look at Poilievre. In recent years, a quiet but troubling trend has emerged in Canadian elections called candidate stuffing. Ballots that used to feature just a handful of legitimate names are now bloated with 50, 80, or even more than 90 candidates, many of whom are fake or fraudulent. These individuals have no real intention of winning or contributing to the democratic process. Their purpose? To overwhelm voters, create confusion, delay the process, and then use the chaos as a political platform to push a narrative that looks democratic. But if you take a closer look at the activist groups, I don't believe that they're democratic at all. They're democratic for themselves, not the rest of Canada. For years, this was treated like a harmless activist stunt, but everything changed when Pierre Poilievre lost his riding. That loss turned candidate stuffing from an oddity into a national controversy and potentially a crisis in how we run fair elections. The organization that's driving these long ballots is appropriately named the Longest Ballot Committee, and it's a network of activists who are trying to create chaos in elections by stuffing so many candidates onto the ballot that it slows down the process, it angers people, it causes delays for people who want to vote, it puts those who are, actually voting under pressure because there are big lineups and there's a lot more chaos happening. And in creating the chaos and anger that they are creating, they provoke a fight, and there's nothing the media loves more than a good fight. Once the media gets involved, what they do, especially our state-funded media, they invite the Longest Ballot Committee spokespersons on, rather than bringing on experts who could talk about the impact of long ballots and how it is actually harmful to our democracy, not helpful. They give these people a straight out platform to say whatever they like. And when you take a closer look at the organizations, they're not centralist pro-democracy activists, right? If they were here for all Canadians, I think I would have a bit more respect for them, but they're not. Now, if you look at the type of voting that they promote, and if you also go to their networks and you actually look up the people and you look up the discussions and you read their materials and you spend a bit of time learning about them, what you find is they probably range from a little bit of centralist to far radical leftist activists. And a lot of people are on the ballot. When you start looking at the ones who are pushing their ideology stronger, they're way down the far left spectrum. In a response to what they've been doing, a number of actors have been stepping up and saying, we've got to stop this problem. One of the most interesting is a letter that was written by the chief electoral officer, where he was outlining the problem and trying to get something done to stop this. And so far, it seems Elections Canada does not have the power to make the changes. Now, I do not understand what's happening at the level above Elections Canada in terms of the political environment where our democratic processes manage. I don't understand the details of how that operates, but I suspect that Elections Canada does not have the power to solve this, and there's a political fight that needs to happen. Most people, they don't think about ballot design as something that can sway an election, but researchers, they've actually studied this for over 100 years, and in fact, many electoral systems around the world have strict design rules precisely because poor design can introduce serious bias to electoral outcomes. In this section, I'm only going to talk about a couple of the biases, and we're going to focus specifically on one type called position bias. Let's go over this list that has a number of the major biases that you'll find in the scientific literature about ballot bias. So the first is ballot design flaw-induced votes. So basically, here's the idea. When a ballot is so badly designed, it's insanely confusing and people make mistakes. The classic is called the butterfly ballot, and it's a ballot that was such a botched design job that it's considered to have been the final factor in determining the outcome of the Bush versus Gore US presidential election, in which Al Gore lost the election because of the work of a shoddy graphic designer. Next, we have position bias, and that's the main one we're looking at. Position bias refers to the effect where a candidate's placement on a ballot has a greater effect on their vote share than most people believe. And the idea is that people who are listed higher up or in the best places get more votes, and those in the worst places get less votes. However, the longer the ballot and the more the candidates, the worse the ballot bias becomes. Studies have shown that position bias alone can cause shifts of up to 5% in voting behavior. But those studies usually involve ballots that are far shorter than what we've seen in Canada, with 2 ballots that have had 91 candidates. That's why this issue matters. The more names you add, the more you distort the results, and you deny a fair chance to candidates placed in further down the list or in the worst positions. And you give an unfair advantage to those people who just happen to have last names that start with the letter A. Next, we have adjacency misvotes. This is actually quite big. It's very common. Whenever there's a candidate next to a major candidate, so it'll be someone smaller, maybe known or an unknown, because of people just making normal mistakes on ballots, they'll often accidentally vote for the person above or below them, or sometimes left or right, depending on how the ballot's designed. So it's called an adjacency misvote. It's very common, and it can sometimes take away. I've seen 1 to 2% in some studies. But here's one thing that's also important. This gets much worse as the number of candidates increase. So if you're in a worse position on a ballot with a lot of candidates, there's going to be more misvotes to the person who's buried deep within the giant, insane list. Next, we have incumbency advantage. Basically, people are more likely to vote for the person who already had the job. So if you're ever listed and it says that you're the incumbent, then this has a massive impact on voter choice. Next, we have the party label. Sometimes people don't even care about who they're actually voting for. They vote for the party. So once they see the brand identity of the political party, they take that. Has a huge impact on voting. Next, name similarity. This is a mistake. So often people, they'll be going quick and they see the first name or the last name matches the candidate, but it's not exact. It's a close approximation, and they put in the wrong vote. Next thing, we have name recognition advantage. Obviously, being known as a viable candidate is good, but just even being known helps, right? This is a big principle in marketing of just having familiarity. Helps a lot with trust and willingness to, pay attention and to consider something credible. So often people don't really know who they're voting for. They'll sometimes just vote for someone because they heard of them. And finally, we have identity-based name biases. So people will sometimes not really know who they're voting for, and they'll say, oh, this person's last name, must be from an ethnicity that I trust, or maybe they're an ethnicity I don't trust, and then it causes them to not vote. They could vote based on sex, on cultural identity, all sorts of identity politics factors. And we're a tribal species, and this influences voting. You'll see there's a bunch of check boxes here. And the reason why these check boxes are here is because in the main study that we're going to go through, I had to remove some of the bias so that I could get an accurate measure. And what I removed were adjacent, incumbents, party labels, and people who had the same name as one of the major candidates. To look at position bias, let's start off by taking a look at this fake little ballot here. So what we have is a concept where we have the first candidate, the second candidate, the median candidate, and the last candidate. The reason why we have this is because when we look at the studies, they often look at the first and second candidates and then the last. But others will look at all the candidates, and there's different types of structures. So this is just to be clear on what we're looking at. Now, the median is sometimes going to be called the vertex. So the median is just the middle candidate. But what you do when you're measuring position bias is you try and figure out what's the crappiest place to be on the ballot, and that's considered the vertex. So it's the lowest point of a curve or the worst place to be on a ballot because you're going to get way less votes. So here's a chart from a study from elections in California from 1995 to 2008. And this is interesting because look at the number of elections they analyzed. This is 7,846 elections. This is not a study based on one election. There's a lot of elections here. And the reason why we have a lot of knowledge about the bias in elections is because the data is quite often publicly available, and researchers can just go and get huge amounts of studies. So we know much more about design psychology in elections than we know in most other areas of applied behavioral design and applied behavioral science. So these numbers are not insignificant, and there's a lot of studies like this. So let me show you what's happening here. This is very important. So you see we have the first candidate here on the left, and there's a little error chart here where the first candidate, has a higher number of expected votes, right? So they've got a higher chance of winning because out of the vote share, they get more than other people only because of where they happen to be placed on the ballot, which is the first position. Next, you have a little drop off into the second place. Now, median, so that's somewhere depending on the size of the list. This is in the middle. And from almost all the research, the middle position is the worst place to be. You don't want to be in the middle. It's absolutely the most horrible place for your political career. And finally, we have last place. So there's always actually an improvement from the last place. There's another technical term that you have to remember. It's called the vertex. So the vertex is the lowest point in a curve, and that's where we describe the worst place to be on the ballot. And the vertex, or the median, median's not really good. It's better called the vertex. The vertex position is really the place that sort of shifts around from study to study, and we look for that as being the most disadvantaged because of the curse of where you randomly ended up or because of your last name. There's also have been studies on multi-column ballots, and what they show is that those in the first column receive more votes than those on the second and the third. And I went through one study recently that went up to 5 columns, and basically it drops down as you go further down the list and further over the columns. We can now see how the number of candidates on the ballot makes the bias worse. Now, this is not going to be obvious, so I'm going to explain how this works in the next slide, but let's start off understanding at least what's in front of us. So what you can see is that if we look at the green, which represents ballots with 15 candidates, there the first position gets the most votes. And then you see how this curves down. And in the middle point, it's not quite the worst position, because you see it's more like in the last third where things really bottom out. So it's not quite a U. It's a little bit distorted, and then it comes back up. Now, as we add 25, so the blue, you'll see that it's a smaller curve, but it follows that same sort of trend of, like, best first, second best last, and crappiest in that vertex, that middle position. And then at the bottom we have 35. And you might be looking at this and say, hey, it doesn't look like things get worse as you add more candidates. And that's because we're looking at our chart where the scales are a little different because of the number of candidates running. But when they actually break it down, you'll see that things get worse and worse and worse. So don't be thrown off by this visualization, because what we're looking at is the proportional difference between the votes between the first and middle position. So let's take a look at how that works. So here's the explanation for why the bias actually does get worse. What we have is we have that list of 15. So let's take a look at the 15 candidates in green. And so we'll see them here at the top. So 15 candidates. So first versus vertex. So what that means is we're going to look up the data, the percentage or the ratio of bias that between the starting point and here, that point somewhere in the middle, the worst possible place. Or we could look at first to last. So what's the difference between the first and last candidate, or last to vertex? So basically, when we extract the numbers, we can look at candidates in any position and say, what is their relative vote advantage or disadvantage? And so when we go through that, we go over, and it's the ratio column we want to look at. And so the ratio goes from first to vertex is 1.18, and then worst to last, 1.08 and 1.09 between the last position and the vertex. So things are obviously the worst differences when you're going from the best to the worst point. But look what happens as we go up to 25 candidates. So just comparing the first to the vertex. So you've got a 1.18 at the first one, and then it jumps to 1.26. And then when we add 35 candidates to a list, now it's at 1.32. So these ratio differences are so massive. So if I apply even the low ratio here of first to vertex to Pierre Poilievre's writing, he should have won. So I'm putting these numbers into perspective. Now, the way you do the math is a little bit more complex, and there's another step that we would do after this. But the point is that we can look at people in the best and worst position. So you're probably wondering, well, where were the two candidates? And we'll get to that. Now, one of the main takeaways that you'll see across the science is this very important and critical lesson that as the number of candidates increase, the biases also increase. So a number of the biases that we went over, they become worse. And so the reason why candidate stuffing is such a problem is that it's something that can be exploited. And so I think we need to start thinking about candidate stuffing as a form of electoral fraud. And so we have ballot stuffing, where we take fake votes and we use those to benefit our target candidate, right? That's absolutely outlawed. That's a known fraudulent act. But for some reason, we don't see candidate stuffing in the same light. But candidate stuffing gets more people to vote for the best positioned candidate. But candidate stuffing is something that you can do to subvert an election when you know the last name of the politician you're trying to take out, and you know the last name of the politician you're trying to put in. And you can decide, will it be advantageous to add more people to the ballot to create more confusion so that the better positioned candidate has a better chance of winning? And in Canada, since our federal elections are all ordered alphabetically by last name, you can absolutely use this technique to swindle your way into success in a Canadian federal election. Swing voters are the people who arrive at the polls undecided, and they're the most susceptible and the most vulnerable to ballot design bias, especially position bias. When faced with an overwhelming number of options, like the 91 name ballots, these voters often make snap decisions just based on visual cues, and they're not really thinking about this as detailed political analysis. And they tend to choose the first viable option that they can find. In Carleton, that was the Liberal candidate whose name appeared in a far superior place on the ballot compared to Pierre Poilievre's. Based on my estimates, the Liberal candidate's name took about half the time to find. When it comes to swing voter psychology, let's start off by dealing with an interesting question that a lot of researchers ask, and that's, how do voters actually make up their mind? So there's a number of theories that have been floating around over the years and that have been developed, but there's one nice framework that I think captures a lot of the different perspectives and puts it into a nice, simple three-package concept. The idea is that there's three heuristics. What's a heuristic? A heuristic is a rule that a person uses as a intuitive way of figuring things out in the world. They're not conscious. They're the way our brain naturally makes decisions. And because our brain has a lot of shortcuts for figuring out the complexities of the world, it also makes a lot of systematic biased decisions. The idea is that there's three main heuristics, so primary, secondary, and tertiary heuristic. So the idea of the primary heuristic is that's the thing that really matters. That's the only basis for really making a political decision. It's like, what are the policies of the politicians? What values do they stand up for and defend? What are the issues? How will this impact on your life? The secondary are the superficial things, like looking at a person's age and gender and maybe some ideological things a little bit, going with some superficial cues, and you're like, oh, okay, that person might be good, or I heard of their name, I think they might be good. So these are considered really non-substantive. People do this all the time. Whatever name pops into their head or they're familiar with is like, oh, I heard something good about that person, right? So that's like non-substantive. A lot of people do that. The tertiary, this is where we've got a real problem. So these are really superficial. So this is like the ballot position. You vote for the first person on the name, rank, order, things that sort of stand out. It's considered that people are more likely to do this when they're voting with low information. So they don't really understand the issues and they don't know the players at all. Or they're also under a lot of pressure, which can be, a problem if you're at a very busy voting booth and you got to get in and out pretty quickly, and it's a bit tense. People have been waiting for a while. So the tertiary are the worst types of political voting. And the question is, how many people do them? Because the people that are doing these tertiary voting, they're the ones who are hyper sensitive to being persuaded by the rank order of the ballot. So to understand how many Canadians are swing voters, let's look at a couple of opinion polls. This one study from 2019 by Angus Reid found that 48% of Canadians were less likely to know who they were going to vote for in the election at the time. And what they did is they followed up with certain categories of undecided voters, and then they started trying to dig in with questions to figure out how undecided voters finally come to their final conclusion. What they found is that about 38% made up their mind in the middle of the campaign or earlier, 27% in the final week, 12% just a couple of days before, and 23% only decided on voting day. So to really understand the truly, truly undecided voters, those swing voters who are absolutely unpredictable, this final question says, in the end, what describes your final decision? Would you say you end up voting pretty much the way you were leaning all along? So that's 56%. And now we're getting into the truly undecided. It says you're leaning towards a different party and then changed your mind in the end. And that's at 23%. So total switcheroo, 23%. And then this last one at 21%, I don't fully know what this means. It says you were really undecided and didn't favor any party until you made up your mind. I think what they're asking there is people who can't really give a rational explanation, and it says you just did what you did and you don't really know why. So you didn't know and then you did something. So that's 21%, absolutely no rational explanation given. Since we had one study and then a follow-up study, it might not be clear how does this generalize to Canadians. So let's unpack it and tie it up. We have about 52% of Canadians were certain ahead of the election. 33% were fairly certain, and then there were 15% who were in very low certainty categories. So 6.6% of them voted as intended, but 9.4%, they had no idea, they changed their mind at the last minute, or they didn't really give a rational explanation. So my general takeaway from this is that roughly about 15% of Canadians are swing voters who could be influenced by ballot design factors, which means as more and more candidate stuffing happens, 15% of Canadians are way more likely to have their votes swayed. But here's the really concerning thing. There's still about 10% who are hyper susceptible. They seem extremely arbitrary and at the highest risk of being swayed by position bias, which is amplified massively by candidate stuffing. Well, the theory helps us understand that there's a serious problem with long ballots. It's the data that really makes the case. And I developed a research method following standard practices used by other scientists who have measured ballot bias, especially rank order bias. Everyone who put themselves on a ballot as a fake candidate also put themselves on the ballot as a data point. And when we look at all the fake candidates who people don't know, who received votes, we can look at their proportional vote share and use them as data points to measure the systematic bias that exists in Canadian federal elections. And if that bias follows the same pattern that we will see in studies that cover thousands of elections with tens of thousands of candidates, we can use that as pretty good evidence that our large Canadian ballots are just as biased as what the science is saying. We have to briefly discuss the research methodology and then I'll show you the goods right after. The first thing that I did is I went to Elections Canada and I downloaded data. Next, we go to Elections Canada. We find a list of all the official registered political parties. We're gonna remove all of them from the list. We're gonna screen each of the people on the list here and we're gonna figure out, have any of them been doing something that would derive votes? So we find people are doing promotion, media relations, any outreach that's major and significant. And some people are going to get votes for non-substantive reasons, such as those who are getting votes because they share the same last name or first name as one of the major candidates, or they're adjacent an official political party. This gives me a list of all the candidates who are just names on a list who have not been doing anything that would give them votes, and we can use them to measure the ballot bias. Then I'm going to go through each of the ballots, and this is a small version of the Carleton ballot. It's not to scale. The original was much longer. I have to figure out who is in what order, where are they exactly on this? And then I got to convert this to numbers because that's what we do as researchers. And to really geek out, I make a whole bunch of metrics. So I find different ways to measure the rank order, looking at relationships from top to bottom of each column, look at cross columns, and I convert these into different types of numerical sequences. And what's a research project without a little bit of Python? So I wrote a little handy dandy Python script. The handy dandy Python script spits out 1 vote per person with ballot position data, giving me a nice data set with 86,060 votes. So 1 vote per person. We can do this for any election in Canada. Now I can pull this in SPSS and do the fancy stats stuff. So let's take a look. Here's where the candidates fell on the ballot. The Liberal candidate, Bruce Fanjoy, was in the first column, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was on the second column in the middle. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, they're both in pretty crappy looking places. Well, that's not exactly how it works. Yes, they were both in bad places, but there's a very big difference between being in the first versus the second column. And then as we go down, there's a different trend. To understand the impact of being in the first versus the second column, let's look at this Danish study that includes over 10,000 candidates from over 100 elections. And what they show is that as you go from the first position in the first, the second, third, and fourth column, the share of votes drastically drops off. And the biggest drop off is between the first and the second column. And things just get crappier and crappier from that point onward. So how did this fare with the Canadian election? The chart that we have here shows the difference between the first and the second column. But keep this in mind. These are not the votes of Pierre Poilievre and Bruce Fanjoy. Instead, these are the votes from the fake candidates, all those stuffed candidates who were doing nothing to get votes. This is how the vote share was panning out. And you'll see that it largely looks like that other study where things get worse as we go on. So some people might be skeptical and say, well, Bruce sucked up more votes and then people stopped voting after they saw him. So can that be defended? No, and here's why. The exact same trend operates across 3 different elections that all had candidate stuffing. In the Carleton election, of course, we just went over that, but in St. Paul's, you also have the same trend, and La Salle, the Quebec election, that also had candidate stuffing, we see the same trend yet again. So in all cases, you go from column 1 to column 2, and there's a massive drop-off in terms of the candidate stuffed candidates who receive vote share, showing that the ballot displays patterns of systematic bias. Now let's take a look at how this operates vertically as we go down the ballot. Here we have this chart that we already went through. Just to keep this in mind, remember this trend. So the first position always gets the most votes and then it drops down, and it follows what we call the U-shape or a J-shaped curve. So we see this exact same pattern here in the Carleton writing. So as we have section 1 up here, we've got the most votes. Section 2 then has the second most. Section 3 is the crappiest, and section 4 is a little less crappy. Some people might be saying, well, both candidates were in the crappy zone, so what's the big deal? Well, here's the big deal. There's a column trend as well, and this happens at the same time. So as we go down the first column here in green, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have the trend where we're going 1, 2, 3, and 4. So Bruce Fanjoy was in the worst position in the better column. And then as we go down the second column with the yellow, we've got 1, 2, deeper dive and up. And of course, people might be arguing, well, again, this was a fluke. Bruce Fanjoy sucked up the votes. No. To test if this was a fluke or a one-off, let's compare these results to all 3 elections in Canada that had massive candidate stuffing. Taking a closer look at Carleton, we can see the pattern almost perfectly matches. You have the first section versus first candidate, and we have that U-shape or J-shape pattern that's emerging in Carleton. Now, if we look at Toronto, St. Paul's writing, here we have, again, the same pattern. The second section is maybe a little higher up, but you can see the general U or J-shaped pattern has already taken form. And also, if we look into the Quebec election, we see largely the same shape happening. So that's 3 separate elections. So let's take a look at how they line up side by side. All of them match very well. So Is this a fluke? Is this not a fluke? Well, typically, you don't expect 3 separate elections to match the same pattern as almost 8,000 elections from another part of the world, unless this is representing a well-known statistical trend, which in my opinion, it looks pretty incriminating to me. A lot of people want to know, was the ballot bias bad enough to have changed the outcomes of the election? And to do that, I followed a pretty simple method that was in the studies that we already went over. So I'm not doing anything fancy, really, really basic statistical modeling. Well, some of my models came out showing that Pierre Poilievre would have just received a few more votes. Others showed that he should have received a lot more of the vote share. So what I'm sharing with you is a middle of the road predictive model. And what it shows is that you can see the heat map here. Pierre Poilievre was in one of the worst positions on the ballot. And almost every model I build always keeps taking me down to this point. This is actually quite hard to resist because it's all over the data across the 3 different elections. Well, Pierre Poilievre tends to end up in the worst possible position on the second column. Bruce Fanjoy, he tends to end up in the worst position on the first column. But if you remember, the first column does much better than the second column, and there's a big step difference between the two. So when you're comparing the two, it's not that they're both in bad positions. It's that Bruce Fanjoy of the Liberal Party is in the bad position, while Pierre Poilievre of the Conservative Party is in the worst possible position. So what we're really comparing is bad to worse. And it's that proportional difference where we find the bias. And that bias tends to be large enough to sway the outcome of the election. In this middle of the road predictive model that I'm showing you, what we can see is that if we take out the bias, that Pierre Poilievre should have received 49% of the vote, not 45.8, and Bruce Fanjoy should have received 47.7, not 50.8. This is not the absolute truth. This is a predictive model following standard published scientific methods. Other behavioral and political and social researchers will approach this in different ways. They'll probably reach different conclusions. So the point of this is not to say, here's the absolute proof, but to say, this looks really bad. I followed very standard processes. I followed standard methods. And most of the time, it comes out looking like the election was swayed, possibly the point of changing the outcome by candidate stuffing. So I will follow up with another video going through the methodology in detail, and I will share all the data and the Python scripts. So hopefully a number of other specialists can weigh in with their point of view based on how they tear down the data and build up their models. I want to share a quick story. While I was training the team at Elections Canada in Ottawa, I told something to one of the officers. I know it sounds cheesy, but I'm really proud of this job because it feels like I'm helping the guardians of democracy. And I felt it was like so cheesy to say that. And he looked at me and he said, you know, I feel the same way. And I think that was absolutely the right answer. So a lot of people, they don't trust Elections Canada. But from my experience, Elections Canada is full of people who take their job seriously. And they understand that they're operating in a vulnerable position and they are the defenders of our democracy. But you need to understand that their power is limited. They can only do so much. And that's why I believe the only way to tackle long ballots is by raising awareness. And there's 2 main ways that we can do this. So the first is we need to just educate the public about the psychology behind position bias so people understand why candidate stuffing leads to unfair elections. And second, we need to share the data with political and behavioral scientists so that they can review it, they can challenge it, and help shape a broader conversation that's grounded in evidence. If you found this video helpful, I'd be grateful if you give it a thumbs up, share it, and also subscribe to the channel if you'd like to follow along. This will help me get the word out, and as a new channel, this will be really helpful. So till the next time.